Silas Moore shoved a folded scrap of paper into Harlan West's palm the moment their paths crossed. It was not kindness, it was forceful, abrupt, almost hostile. His fingers pressed hard, his face expressionless, his eyes refusing to meet Harlan's. By the time Harlan registered the gesture, Silas had already turned, dragging luggage with a grim, exhausted gait. The paper pulsed in Harlan's hand like a warning. Around him, the grand lobby glittered with chandeliers, but the light felt sharp, merciless. Staff eyes skimmed over him, mocking the awkward uniform, the clumsy stance of a supposed trainee. Invisible in his own empire, he clenched his fist around the secret no one else had noticed. Silas looked broken, careless, forgettable, yet the reckless act told another story. Something was wrong here. And in that single slip of paper lay the first crack one that threatened to shatter the hotel's perfect facade. What could possibly be written inside, and why would a bellhop risk everything to deliver it? Follow this channel because the truth will not wait quietly. Harlan West had once commanded boardrooms where a single nod from him set empires shifting. His name spoken aloud carried weight across continents. Yet here he stood in borrowed shoes, their soles squeaking against marble too fine for such cheap leather, his shoulders pressed into a jacket 2 sizes too wide. No chauffeur, no entourage, only the disguise of a trainee no one cared to notice. He had chosen this fall deliberately. "I need to know how they live when no one is watching," he had told himself before stepping into the role. What dignity remained had been folded away with his tailored suits, replaced by a badge that misnamed him, and a silence that marked him as insignificant. The contrast burned. The empire he had built gleamed around him, crystal chandeliers and brass railings polished to a cruel perfection. But he felt the sting of invisibility, the bitter taste of contempt reserved for the lowest rung. Pride clawed at him, yet he swallowed it whole because only in this disguise could he learn who his people truly were. And already, one man, a bellhop whose eyes had been dulled by exhaustion, had slipped him a warning disguised as a note. A silent act that threatened to unravel the illusion of order. The disguise was supposed to reveal hidden truths. He had not expected them to come hunting him so quickly. Evelyn Cross arrived with heels striking marble like a metronome of authority. Her gaze swept the lobby sharp and cold, cutting through uniforms and bodies with the ease of someone who believed herself untouchable. When her eyes found Harlan, they lingered only long enough to confirm what she already thought another useless hire undeserving of her time. Move luggage. Nod. Don't speak unless spoken to, she said flatly. No greeting, no instruction beyond commands stripped of respect. Her words fell like lashes, each syllable designed to remind him of his place. Harlan lowered his eyes, his chest tightening against the indignity. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him that way. The irony was sharp. He had written the very training manuals she now ignored. Watching her dismiss him with contempt, he felt the distance between the empire he thought he ran and the reality his staff endured. Evelyn's posture never softened, her face carved into authority as if sympathy had no value here. Every gesture reinforced her dominion, a clipped hand toward the elevators, a disdainful glance at his uncertain grip on a suitcase. The lobby, for all its glitter, seemed to darken around her. What should have been order felt instead like tyranny disguised as discipline. In her, the hotel had found not a guardian, but a warden. And in that moment, Evelyn Cross revealed more than she intended, not just control, but the rot of a culture that had long gone unchecked. Jonas Reed greeted him next, stepping from behind the polished desk with a smile stretched too wide. The kind of smile that glimmered at a distance but wilted under the weight of its own insincerity. His suit was crisp, his tie neatly aligned, his voice coated with a sweetness that never reached his eyes. "New here right?" Jonas asked, his tone feather light. "Think you'll last more than a week?" The words danced as a joke, yet behind them lurked a blade of mockery. His gaze flicked to Harlan's scuffed shoes, his oversized jacket, and returned with a spark of satisfaction. Harlan answered with silence, but the sting landed nonetheless. Jonas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This place chews through people like you." Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, plastering his smile once more for a passing guest, as if kindness had always been his nature. The duplicity hung in the air. To the guests, Jonas appeared polished, attentive, indispensable. To Harlan, he was a mirror of opportunism, bright on the surface, hollow underneath. It was the type of man who rose quickly in broken systems, not by service, but by survival. Jonas's laughter followed Harlan as he turned away, light and careless, but sharpened at the edges. The sound lingered like a promise. For all his easy charm, Jonas Reed was no ally. He was a man who would smile as he pushed another toward the fall. And Harlan, though silent, understood this was only the beginning. Silas Moore stumbled into the lobby, late chest-heaving hair damp with sweat. His shirt clung unevenly to his back creases, running like scars across cheap fabric. The air seemed to pause as Evelyn Cross turned her voice slicing through the room. "Late again, Moore." The question was an accusation, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. Every head turned. Jonas smirked behind his polished desk. A pair of porters exchanged glances, lips curling with contempt. Even Clara, shrinking at the edge of the hall, lowered her gaze, unwilling to share the shame that clung to him. Harlan watched, recording the moment like evidence. The slouch, the tardiness, the weight of disdain pressing on the man from all sides, it painted a picture that required no defense. A failure, Harlan thought, the conclusion almost too easy. The lobby, bright and ordered, made Silas appear smaller, out of place, a shadow against the chandelier's glow. In that instant, his role in this grand facade seemed sealed. The weak link, everyone tolerated the man destined for reprimand. The folded paper still rested in Harlan's pocket, but now it seemed absurd. How could anything important come from hands so careless? Minutes later, Silas gripped the handle of a suitcase, its weight tilting awkwardly in his tired grasp. The guest, a businessman with silver cufflinks and a scowl carved deep into his face, watched as the luggage slipped. It hit the floor with a dull, accusing thud. Evelyn's response was immediate. "You've shamed this hotel," she hissed, her voice carrying enough venom to stain marble. The guest's eyes narrowed, lips tight with displeasure. Silas bent quickly, his silence heavier than the suitcase itself. He lifted the bag again, head bowed as though swallowing punishment had become routine. Harlan observed with cold detachment. The evidence mounted lateness, clumsiness, now public embarrassment. A liability he judged the word echoing like a verdict. The disguise allowed him to see, but what he saw only deepened his contempt. The rhythm of disdain in the lobby grew louder. Evelyn's bite, the guest's glare, Silas's silence. Each step built upon the last, each mistake feeding the belief that this man was unworthy of trust. And still the scrap of paper burned faintly in Harlan's pocket, waiting to contradict everything. Clara Hayes emerged from a side corridor, her arms straining against the weight of a bin stacked with towels. Small, pale, and nervous, she moved carefully, eyes darting away from Evelyn's sharp presence. For a moment she seemed invisible, another fragile piece in the machinery of service. Silas crossed the floor, his movements weary yet deliberate. Without a word, he slid his hands beneath the bin, lifting just enough to ease her burden. Clara startled, then glanced up, lips trembling with a whispered thank you. Her eyes, fleeting but sincere, softened in the gloom. Harlan noticed, though, he dismissed it as nothing more than a fleeting gesture. To him, it was clumsy gallantry from a man still marked as careless. He saw awkwardness, not grace, weakness, not kindness, but for Clara, the relief was real. And for anyone watching closely, a crack had appeared in the portrait of incompetence. Silas Moore, painted as the fool of the lobby, revealed a flicker of quiet humanity. A flicker easy to miss and easier still to ignore. The story, however, had only begun to show its teeth. Mr. Grayson entered the lobby like a storm contained in a tailored suit. His watch gleamed, his shoes struck marble with authority, and his eyes swept the room with practiced disdain. Every glance carried judgment, as though the hotel itself were already beneath his standards. Jonas Reed hurried forward, bowing almost to the point of humiliation. "Welcome, sir." "Your suite is prepared," he murmured, his voice dripping with flattery. His grin widened, too sharp, too eager, as though his survival depended on the approval of this single guest. Grayson's lips barely moved when he spoke. "I don't want delays. Not one." His tone was calm but laced with threat, the kind of voice that promised punishment for even the smallest inconvenience. The staff stiffened. Evelyn's posture grew straighter, her eyes scanning the floor like a hawk searching for weakness. Harlan watched the ripple of fear pass through the lobby, noting how power radiated from a guest who offered nothing but money and contempt. In that moment, Grayson became more than a client. He was a test one that would magnify every flaw, every hesitation, and especially every mistake made by the weary bellhop already under scrutiny. The tension lingered after Grayson's words, and Evelyn Cross wasted no time directing her disdain. Her gaze locked on Harlan, then flicked to Silas Moore with cold calculation. "You trainee," she snapped. "Shadow Moore. Learn how to carry properly. Maybe you'll last longer than most." The words landed like a punishment, not an instruction. Harlan's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, falling in step behind the bellhop he despised. Silas trudged ahead, shoulders rounded, every motion slow, as though even walking were a burden. The sight only hardened Harlan's contempt. "This," he thought, "is the example I'm expected to learn from." Around them, Jonas smirked faintly as if entertained by the pairing. Clara watched from the distance, her face unreadable, caught between pity and fear. The disguise demanded patience, but bitterness gnawed at Harlan's pride. He told himself that observation required endurance, yet each step beside Silas felt like degradation. Still, he followed because the game demanded it. What he could not know, what no one yet guessed, was that walking in Silas Moore's shadow would soon lead him into places where the polished light of the lobby could never reach. They moved through the corridors together, Harlan trailing the bellhop like a reluctant shadow. Silas handled luggage with sluggish motions, pausing too often, sighing as though each step drained him further. His hands lacked precision. A suitcase scraped the floor, the dull sound carrying down the hall. The guest frowned immediately, lips pressing into a line of irritation. To him, service demanded invisibility, quiet, seamless, without flaw. Silas's clumsy pace was an offense in itself. Jonas's voice floated behind them, soft enough to sting. "He's always like this?" The words were casual but laced with mockery. Harlan absorbed the scene, his mind building its case. Late to work, careless, with guests now sloppy in execution, each moment reinforced the portrait of incompetence. A liability, he thought, again, his judgment sharpening. The atmosphere thickened not with open conflict, but with the unspoken verdict of everyone watching. Silas's silence only deepened the impression that he was resigned to his role as failure. For Harlan, the conclusion felt inevitable. For the listener, the tension mounted. Every small misstep tightened the grip of disdain, creating a rhythm of frustration that demanded release. And still the mystery of that folded paper whispered of contradictions yet to surface. The cart rattled under the weight of too many bags pushed awkwardly by two men who looked nothing alike, yet moved in equally clumsy rhythm. A family crowded around them, impatient eyes darting to the clock as though every second lost was a crime. Harlan's hands fumbled with a suitcase stacked too high. It tilted dangerously, nearly toppling onto the polished stone floor. Gasps cut the air sharp and immediate. Careful Silas hissed under his breath, voice edged with irritation. The reprimand stung worse than the stumble. The guest turned sharp faces toward both of them, judgment, heavy contempt, unspoken, but loud. Harlan's jaw clenched. In his mind, the correction wasn't help. It was humiliation delivered by a man already marked as useless. He felt stripped of dignity, reduced to a trainee exposed before strangers, all because of Silas Moore's tone. The cart steadied the moment past, but the bitterness lingered. For the first time, Harlan's contempt for Silas sharpened into something personal, something raw. What began as detached observation was turning into resentment, and the shadow of that folded paper in his pocket seemed more absurd than ever. How could any truth come from hands that only shamed him? Mr. Grayson summoned service to his suite with a snap of authority. His request was simple water, nothing more, but his eyes promised consequences if it arrived late. Silas moved swiftly, grabbing 2 bottles from the cart. Then, without warning, he slipped a third into Harlan's pocket. The motion was fast, secretive, almost practiced. Harlan froze, startled by the weight against his side. "What is he doing?" he muttered, voice barely audible. The act was too deliberate to be clumsy. Inside the suite, Grayson barely looked at them. He accepted the bottles, his frown softening only slightly, then dismissed them with a curt nod. The door closed, sealing silence behind it. Harlan's mind raced. Why hide an extra bottle? Why involve him? His disguise demanded composure, yet unease gnawed at him. Was this man stealing, framing him? The thought hardened suspicion into near certainty. The hallway stretched quiet, the secret bottle pressing cold against his hip. Silas walked ahead without explanation, his shoulders heavy, his pace unchanged. And behind him, Harlan carried not just the weight of water, but the first crack of paranoia. Something was wrong, though what it was remained hidden, and it demanded an answer. The corridor was still when Evelyn's heels struck the floor like a warning bell. She appeared without pause, eyes narrowing the moment she saw Harlan standing uncertain, his posture betraying hesitation. "What are you doing here?" Her voice sliced the air. "Follow Moore. Do not waste my time." Heat rose to Harlan's face. He bowed his head, swallowing words he wanted to speak. The disguise bound him to silence, and so he obeyed, shame coiling in his chest. Silas, pausing at the end of the hall, caught the exchange. His eyes flicked back a flash of something, unreadable mockery perhaps, or simple weariness, but to Harlan it looked like scorn. Evelyn's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before shifting away, satisfied with his submission. Her authority pressed down like a weight, reminding him that even here, stripped of his name, he was expected to bend. The humiliation deepened Harlan's resentment. Each moment with Silas seemed to amplify his frustration, not ease it. For the staff watching, nothing had changed. The bellhop still trudged, the trainee still faltered. But for Harlan, the story was turning personal. He no longer simply observed Silas Moore. He was beginning to despise him. Jonas Reed drifted close as the crowd thinned his smile, warm enough to disarm. He leaned toward Harlan, his voice lowered to a whisper meant only for one ear. Silas is trouble. Always has been. Stay too close and you'll go down with him. The words slipped like poison light in tone, yet heavy with intent. Jonas straightened quickly, his polished grin restored for the benefit of anyone passing by. Only his eyes betrayed him, cold, sharp, calculating. Harlan felt the message settle into place, another stone on the pile of suspicion already forming in his mind. Silas. Late Silas, clumsy Silas. Reckless, and now even colleagues painted him as dangerous. It was confirmation, he thought, though the conviction did not comfort him. The irony was clear to any silent observer. Jonas's words reeked of opportunism, not truth. He played both sides, smiling to every face, hiding his contempt behind courtesy. But Harlan, bound by disguise, heard only warning. The seed had been planted deeper, watered with doubt, and soon it would grow into something harder to uproot. Silas Moore, in his weary silence, had just inherited another shadow. The elevator doors slid shut, trapping polished silence inside. A family stood near the back, their bags stacked carefully at their feet. One suitcase bore a thin scratch across its leather, faint but noticeable. The father's voice carried disapproval. "Look at this. Damaged. Unacceptable." Before Harlan could register the words, Evelyn Cross moved. "More." She snapped, her tone decisive. Careless as always. Silas stiffened, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't me," he said quietly, but his defiance lacked force against Evelyn's certainty. Her pen was already scratching across her notepad, recording the offense in ink that would not fade. The guest shook his head, displeasure radiating, and the accusation became truth by sheer repetition. Harlan observed, detached yet firm in his judgment. If this is the pattern, he thought, discipline is inevitable. The ride lasted seconds, but the humiliation stretched long. Silas stood rigid, silent, cornered by both authority and perception. And Harlan, rather than questioning the ease of Evelyn's verdict, found his own skepticism hardening further. The stain of incompetence had spread, and once marked it, rarely washed clean. Later that evening, the calm of the lobby cracked. A guest stumbled in his gait, unsteady words slurred with drink. His voice rose quickly, echoing harsh against marble, demanding attention. Silas moved first. He approached with hands slightly raised, voice measured, trying to soften the storm. "Sir, please, let me help you." The man recoiled violently, shoving his arm away. "Don't touch me." His shout drew every eye in the room. Evelyn appeared almost instantly, her expression unreadable as she pulled out her notepad. Her pen moved without hesitation, recording another strike against Silas, who stood frozen, accused without trial. To the guests, the moment confirmed failure, a bellhop clumsy enough to provoke rather than calm. To Harlan, watching from the edges, it felt like proof of everything Jonas had whispered earlier. Reckless. Burdensome. A liability. Silas's attempt at control had collapsed into public disgrace, and though the truth was more complicated, the perception alone was enough to harden judgment. The lobby returned to order, but the mark on Silas Moore remained. Clara Hayes passed quietly through the corridor, a bundle of linens in her arms, her steps light as though she wished to vanish. As she drew near Harlan, she slowed, leaning close enough that her words barely carried beyond a whisper. "He isn't as bad as he looks." The words startled Harlan. He turned, catching her eyes for the briefest second. There was no hesitation there, only sincerity, and something else, gratitude, etched in her small, weary smile. But he shook his head, dismissing it as misplaced kindness. She pities him, he thought, refusing to let the seed take root. To Harlan, the record spoke clearly, late, careless, incompetent. Nothing Clara said could erase what he had seen with his own eyes. Clara glanced toward Silas, who moved ahead, his shoulders bent but steady. Her gaze lingered on him with quiet warmth as if recalling something unspoken. Then she lowered her eyes, retreating into silence, leaving Harlan to his judgments. Yet for the listener, her words marked the first fracture in the simple picture. A quiet reminder that truth was not as easily measured as appearances suggested. The seed had been planted even if Harlan refused to see it. Together, Harlan and Silas maneuvered a heavy cart into Mr. Grayson's suite. The air inside was perfumed thick with wealth and arrogance. Grayson watched them with arms folded, impatience radiating like heat. "You're too slow," he said sharply, his tone more command than critique. Silas bowed his head, enduring the scorn without a word. Harlan bore the brunt of the load, his muscles tight, his jaw set against the weight. He expected at least a nod of acknowledgement when the bags were placed in perfect order. None came. Instead, Grayson tossed a handful of coins onto the polished table, the sound of metal ringing like insult. Not a tip, but a dismissal. Harlan saw Silas stoop, fingers closing around the coins with practiced ease. The motion was too quick, too familiar. Without hesitation, Silas slipped the money into his pocket. The sight struck like confirmation. To Harlan, it was no longer doubt, but proof the man was greedy, shameless, willing to pocket scraps without shame. The door shut behind them, sealing the insult inside. Yet what lingered was not only the contempt of a guest, but the image of Silas Moore stooping for coins as if they belonged to him alone. The hallway outside was quiet, the air cooler after the suffocating presence of Mr. Grayson. Silas walked ahead without pause, but after a few steps he turned and pressed the coins into Harlan's hand. "You keep it," he said, voice flat, almost careless. Harlan froze, staring at the money now burning in his palm. "Why give it to me?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Silas offered no explanation. His eyes flicked once toward Harlan, unreadable, then away. Without breaking stride, he continued down the hall, his silence heavier than any answer. The gesture unsettled Harlan. Was it mockery, a reminder of his lowly role, or a dismissal as though even scraps were too small for Silas to bother with? Suspicion, coiled tighter, fueled not by action, but by the absence of clarity. Clara's whispered defense, still fresh in Harlan's mind, now clashed with this paradox. Gratitude on one side, arrogance on the other. To the listener, the contradiction deepened. To Harlan, it hardened his disdain. In his mind, generosity was the last possibility. He saw only contempt wrapped in silence, and the distance between them grew sharper. The shift slowed into evening, and during the break, Harlan noticed Silas slipping quietly toward the service exit. A plastic bag dangled from his hand, its shape lumpy with food containers hastily packed. His pace was quick, almost furtive, as though the act itself required secrecy. Harlan hesitated, then followed. The alley behind the hotel breathed a different air, damp shadowed, carrying the faint odor of refuse. Silas walked with purpose, disappearing past the corner before Harlan could close the gap. Each step tightened Harlan's suspicion. Was this theft, smuggling a scheme to sell food on the side? The disguise had brought him here to uncover weaknesses, and this looked like one unraveling in real time. The plastic bag swung heavily with each stride, the faint clatter of containers echoing down the narrow street. Harlan kept his distance, his pulse quickening with the tension of pursuit. By the time Silas vanished into the turn, Harlan's mind braced for exposure, for a discovery that might confirm every judgment he had already made. What lay beyond that corner would not simply answer his doubts, it would sharpen them or overturn them entirely. The corner revealed not crime, but an unexpected scene. Silas stood before a figure huddled against the wall, a man wrapped in tattered blankets, his hands trembling in the cold. Silas crouched, lifting the bag with quiet care. He opened it, offering boxes of food with a gentleness absent from his work inside the hotel. The homeless man's face lit with fragile gratitude, his smile faint but radiant. For a moment, the world outside the Grand Hotel shrank to this exchange, one man weary, one man forgotten, both bound by a gesture unseen by anyone else. Silas placed a hand on the man's shoulder, steady and reassuring. A single nod, and then he turned back toward the alley as if the act required no acknowledgement. Harlan froze. The image contradicted everything. The lateness, the clumsiness, the scorn he had swallowed all day. He's giving it away. The thought struck like lightning. For the first time, doubt pierced Harlan's certainty. The bellhop he had dismissed as failure now wore the shadow of something else, quiet decency hidden beneath fatigue. The disguise had revealed cruelty in many, But here it uncovered an unexpected mercy, and that was harder to ignore. Back inside, the hotel's light felt sharper, almost accusing. Harlan's hand drifted to his pocket where the folded scrap still pressed against his side. He drew it out slowly as though bracing for the weight it carried. The paper was creased damp with sweat, the handwriting rough and uneven. He opened it fully for the first time. Tips disappear. Manager takes them. Be careful. The words struck like a blow. His heartbeat quickened, the rhythm heavy in his ears. The note was not nonsense, not a prank. It was warning, urgent and raw. The image of Evelyn Cross flared in his mind, her pen scratching accusations, her eyes always cold. The fragments aligned with sudden clarity. What had seemed incompetence might be resistance. What looked like failure might mask defiance. The revelation unsettled him more than suspicion ever had. The disguise had shown him humiliation and disdain, but now it whispered of corruption festering at the core. The secret was no longer silent. It pulsed from the paper, dragging him deeper into a truth he had not sought but could no longer deny. And the game once controlled had shifted beyond his grasp. Later that night, when the halls had thinned of guests and noise, Harlan closed the distance between himself and Silas. The folded paper weighed heavily in his pocket, the warning inside it now impossible to ignore. "What did you mean by this?" Harlan asked quietly, careful with his words. "Why give it to me?" Silas turned, his expression carved in stone. His voice carried no warmth. "Don't ask. It will be dangerous for you." The reply startled Harlan. "Dangerous?" The word gnawed at him. "Dangerous? Why, what are you hiding?" He pressed his whisper, urgent, almost pleading. But Silas had already turned away, his shoulders set in resignation. He offered nothing further, only silence, as if to answer would place them both in jeopardy. His steps carried him down the corridor, each stride widening the distance. Harlan remained rooted, more unsettled than before. Suspicion no longer sufficed. There was a secret here, something deeper than carelessness or insolence. And Silas Moore, clumsy, scorned, silent, was at the center of it. For the listener, the refusal ignited tension. What truth could be dangerous enough to demand silence? Why involve Harlan at all? The question loomed unanswered, and in its shadow the story tightened. The next day, Harlan lingered near the reception desk, blending into the stream of uniforms. Evelyn Cross stood over the tip ledger, her pen moving briskly, her gaze sharp enough to silence those around her. Harlan's eyes followed the neat columns of numbers, the tidy handwriting that masked a quiet theft. Amounts were crossed out, adjusted, erased altogether. The pattern was subtle, but repetition made it undeniable, tips disappearing into ink and calculation. Jonas hovered nearby, bowing his head whenever Evelyn's gaze lifted. His smile faltered, replaced by a nervous obedience. He knew Harlan thought. He knew and said nothing. Across the desk, Clara bent to her work, her hands trembling as she folded linen. A tear slid unnoticed down her cheek, quickly brushed away with the corner of her sleeve. She did not speak. She never did. The picture sharpened. Authority had become corruption, silence had become complicity, and those who resisted carried scars. The ledger, the tears, the glances, they told the story. Evelyn never would. Harlan felt the truth press heavier upon him. Silas's warning was no fabrication. The system was poisoned, and the infection spread through every page Evelyn touched. The revelation unsettled Harlan long after the ledger closed. He walked the corridors with the image of missing tips carved into his mind, Clara's tear etched deeper than ink. For the first time, certainty fractured. "Maybe I've been wrong about him," he thought. The words resisted, but they lingered, whispering doubt into judgments once absolute. Silas's lateness, his silence, his defiance, they no longer aligned neatly with failure. They carried another weight, one Harlan could not yet name. Still, pride kept him cautious. He maintained distance, his expression cold whenever their paths crossed. Yet Silas seemed to sense the shift. His eyes, weary as ever, lingered on Harlan with a shadow of sadness, as if he recognized the struggle within him. The tension between them deepened. What had begun as contempt was now confusion, the boundaries blurred by contradictions that refused to fade. Every step forward felt heavier, every silence louder, as though the hotel itself waited for the truth to burst open. For the listener, the atmosphere tightened to its breaking point. The disguises, the lies, the warnings, they circled closer, preparing for revelation. The air carried weight enough to suffocate, and all that remained was the inevitability of collapse. The shift ended, but Harlan did not leave. From the shadow of a corridor, he watched Silas move swiftly down the dim hall, his steps urgent, his hand gripping a thick envelope. The sight struck him like a verdict delivered. "There it is," Harlan muttered under his breath. "Proof he's been skimming." Silas glanced over his shoulder, scanning the empty passage as though expecting pursuit. The envelope remained clutched close to his chest, its edges worn from fingers too familiar. Harlan's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary delivery. He followed at a careful distance, each echo of his shoes swallowed by the heavy silence of the after-hours hotel. The marble gleam of the day was gone, replaced by shadows and tension. Silas stopped at a door of the staff lounge, pausing long enough for Harlan to hold his breath. Every instinct screamed that he was seconds from unmasking a thief. His disguise had drawn him into petty failures before, but this was theft betrayal carved in plain sight. Hand raised, Silas tapped lightly at the door. Harlan's chest tightened. The scene hung suspended, the truth one breath away. All he had to do was watch and the mask would shatter. The staff lounge door creaked open, revealing Clara Hayes, her face pale beneath the tired light. Silas stood tall for the first time that day, the envelope held out with deliberate care. "This is your share," he said quietly. "Don't speak of it to anyone." Clara's lips parted, words failing before emotion overtook her. Tears shimmered at the edge of her lashes, the sound of her breath breaking in her throat. She reached for the envelope with trembling fingers as though it contained not money but salvation itself. Harlan staggered inside himself. He's dividing it. For her. The thought clashed violently against the image of theft he had prepared to witness. Every conclusion he had built collapsed under the weight of what unfolded before him. Clara clutched the envelope to her chest, eyes wide with gratitude. She whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." Silas lowered his gaze, his voice steady but hushed. "Just take it. You earned it. No one should take what's yours." The moment stretched heavy with contradictions. Harlan's mind reeled. Was this theft or justice? The listener stood suspended in the same uncertainty, every detail demanding judgment, yet offering no clear path. Clara's composure broke at last. Tears spilled freely as her voice cracked. "If not for you, I would never see a single cent of the tips. They vanish before I can even count them." Silas placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her trembling frame. His voice was calm, edged with quiet defiance. "You deserve every dollar. Evelyn cannot take everything. Not while I'm here." The words struck with the force of revelation. For Harlan, it was as if lightning tore through the fog of suspicion. The envelope, the secrecy, the note pressed into his hand, all threads now pulled into a single truth. Silas Moore, the man painted as clumsy, insolent, incompetent, was not stealing. He was restoring. He was the shield against a system that devoured its weakest. Harlan stood stunned, his judgments unraveling faster than he could contain them. The paper in his pocket no longer felt absurd. It felt prophetic. For the listener, the moment broke open. The narrative inverted, the despised figure revealed as protector. In the space of a few words, contempt became doubt, and doubt swelled toward awe. Nothing about Silas Moore was what it seemed, and now there was no turning back. Harlan left the scene in silence, the weight in his chest heavier than any suitcase he had carried that day. Each step echoed against the tiled floor, hollow and accusing. The envelope, Clara's tears. Silas's quiet defiance, all replayed in his mind with a sharpness that would not fade. Piece by piece, the fragments he had once judged as failure began to realign. The bottle of water slipped into his pocket, once a symbol of theft, now reframed as a gesture of discretion. The coins, tossed by Grayson, thought to be greedily pocketed, revealed themselves as an act of reluctant fairness. The plastic bag, carried into the night, once branded as theft, became sustenance for the forgotten. The contradictions dissolved, replaced by clarity that stung worse than ignorance. He had been wrong. Blinded by appearances, deaf to subtle truths, he had condemned a man who stood quietly against corruption. In the solitude of the corridor, Harlan whispered the words that clung like confession. "I have misjudged him. From the very beginning." For the first time since donning the disguise, the mask felt suffocating. He had sought to uncover weakness in others, yet uncovered blindness in himself. The paradox cut deep, demanding not just acknowledgement, but change. Later, in a dim hallway emptied of noise, Harlan stepped into Silas's path. The disguise no longer mattered. The question demanded air. Why? His voice was firm, not accusing, but searching. "Why do you do all this?" Silas stopped. For once, he did not avert his eyes. His gaze met Harlan's steady and unflinching as though the truth required no preamble. "Because if I don't," he said, his tone low, his words carved with weight, "no one else will." The sentence hung heavy between them, simple yet immovable. It was not an excuse nor an attempt to win sympathy. It was declaration as much for himself as for anyone who dared to ask. The air thickened with the gravity of it. Harlan felt the response settle deep, sharper than any reprimand Evelyn had hurled, heavier than the contempt of guests. It was conviction born from scars, from the willingness to carry burdens others refused. For the listener, the moment revealed more than defiance. It revealed the quiet force of moral resolve, the choice to stand in the breach even when standing alone. Silas Moore's tired frame no longer signaled weakness. It carried the weight of conscience. The corridor remained hushed as the conversation unfolded, each word peeling back a layer. Silas spoke with the weary cadence of a man who had fought too long without reward. "They've written me up more times than I can count," he admitted, his voice even not bitter. "Every time I call Evelyn out, every time I refuse to stay silent, it's another mark against me." Harlan listened, the pieces aligning further. Silas did not pause to dramatize, only to recount. The others see it. They know what she does. But fear keeps them quiet. Fear of losing the little they have. He glanced away, shoulders tightening. "So, I take the blows. Better me than them." Harlan searched his expression, expecting anger or desperation, but finding only resolve. Silas continued quieter now, words like iron under cloth. Sometimes, fairness costs more than silence, and sometimes that cost is solitude. The sentence carried the weight of exile. Branded as trouble, burdened with fines, mocked by peers, yet still unwilling to yield. For Harlan, the judgment reversed entirely. The man, once despised for weakness, now stood revealed as the one who bore the heaviest load. The truth carried not only sorrow, but admiration, reshaping everything that had come before. The corridor was quiet when Harlan asked the question that had hovered unspoken. "And your family? What keeps you here, carrying all this weight?" Silas lowered his gaze. The hardness in his voice faltered, revealing a crack. "My mother is sick. The bills don't stop. I take night shifts every hour I can get just to keep her treatment going." His words caught in his throat, the effort to steady them betraying the pain beneath. He exhaled slowly, then continued. "But even with her in the hospital, I can't stand by and watch Evelyn strip the staff of what little they earn. My silence would make me guilty too." Harlan's hand curled into a fist, his chest tight. The image of Silas, weighed down by fatigue, yet still defiant, collided with the memory of coins, bottles, and scraps of food, all reframed as sacrifice. For the listener, the confession landed with piercing clarity. This was no rebellion for pride. It was survival and conscience bound together, carried on shoulders already burdened by grief. Harlan's heart ached not with pity, but with shame. The man he had scorned revealed himself as the only one brave enough to bleed for others. Later, alone in the narrow room assigned to trainees, Harlan faced his own reflection. The mirror offered a stranger, a man in an ill-fitted jacket, a badge bearing the wrong name, the weary look of someone diminished. Yet beneath the disguise he saw something harsher, shame etched across his features. The power he once carried in boardrooms seemed hollow in the face staring back at him. "I've been blind," he whispered to the reflection. "Blind in my own house." The truth pressed heavier than any disguise. He had built towers of glass and marble, but never glimpsed the darkness that spread beneath their polish. Evelyn's cruelty, Jonas's duplicity, Silas's resilience, none of it had reached him until he stepped into the shadows himself. The realization struck deep. It was not only his staff who had failed under corruption. It was him, the leader, who had not seen the man who had allowed the rot to grow. For the listener, this was the pivot. Pride fractured into humility, arrogance into remorse. The hotel's mirrors no longer reflected luxury. They reflected guilt. And, for the first time, Harlan felt less like an undercover master and more like a penitent student. Morning returned with polished brightness, but Harlan's eyes searched beyond the surface. From the far edge of the lobby he watched Evelyn Cross conduct her ritual with chilling ease. Her hand swept across the counter, gathering envelopes and folded bills. With practiced precision she slipped them into her pocket, her face never breaking its mask of command. Jonas stood nearby, spine bent in servility. His eyes flicked once toward the theft, then dropped instantly, his silence sealing complicity. Clara paused mid-step, her shoulders trembling. She turned away, dabbing a tear before anyone could notice, yet the motion betrayed the pain of someone who had endured this violation too many times. And then Silas, standing at a distance, his expression shadowed. He said nothing, but his eyes darkened, carrying both fury and resignation. Harlan's breath slowed. The final piece of the puzzle had slid into place. What had been whispered, hinted, suspected, now unfolded in plain sight. Evelyn Cross, the enforcer of discipline, was the thief. For the listener, this was revelation solidified the corruption no longer rumor, but proof. The scales tipped fully and the story pressed forward toward reckoning. Harlan stood alone in the stillness of his quarters, the air thick with the echoes of what he had witnessed. Evelyn's theft, Jonas's cowardice, Clara's tears, Silas's quiet defiance, they crowded his thoughts until the weight could no longer be ignored. He whispered into the silence, "It's time." The words carried finality. No longer could he stand as a passive observer behind a disguise. The injustice that Silas had borne, the humiliation he had suffered, the sacrifices hidden beneath his weary silence, all of it demanded exposure. Harlan's pulse quickened not with fear, but with resolve. For weeks he had moved unseen, collecting fragments of truth. Now those fragments aligned into a weapon sharp enough to cut through deceit. The mask of the trainee had served its purpose. What remained was the reckoning. He thought of Silas alone, misunderstood, carrying the burden of others' silence. He thought of the staff bent under Evelyn's control, robbed not only of wages, but of dignity. Their suffering had been invisible to him once. Now it blazed before him, undeniable. The hotel's glittering facade had hidden its rot long enough. Soon, in the full gaze of its staff, the truth would shatter that illusion. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The summons went out, and by evening the staff gathered in the conference hall. The room hummed with unease, the air taut as wire. Evelyn Cross sat at the head of the table, posture erect, her eyes sweeping the room with the authority of someone who expected compliance. Jonas Reed flanked her, nodding quickly at every word she murmured, his smile brittle under the strain. Clara Hayes slipped into a corner, clutching her hands together as though to make herself smaller. Her gaze stayed low, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Silas stood apart, arms crossed, his expression clouded heavy with the knowledge that truth rarely survived such rooms. The staff murmured among themselves, exchanging glances filled with suspicion. No one knew why they had been called, but all sensed a storm brewing beneath the surface. The silence between words grew longer, sharper, until every breath carried tension. And then, from the back of the hall, the doors opened. Harlan entered slowly, still clad in the uniform of a trainee. His presence drew curious looks, though no one yet understood the weight of what he carried with him. The moment crackled. Something was about to rupture, and nothing would remain the same once it did. The room quieted as Harlan walked to the front, his steps deliberate, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. He stopped beneath the pale light, standing not as a servant, but as a figure preparing judgment. He reached for the badge pinned to his chest, the false name, the mark of disguise. Slowly, he unfastened it, the metallic snap echoing louder than it should. All eyes locked onto him. Clara lifted her head in confusion. Silas's brows furrowed suspicion, flickering across his tired features. Jonas's smile faltered, his composure cracking. Even Evelyn leaned forward, her confidence bending under the weight of uncertainty. Harlan's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "I am not who you think I am." The words fell like stone into still water, rippling outward, striking every listener with shock. No one moved. The air grew dense, charged with the gravity of revelation held just out of reach. Evelyn's expression tightened, the first sign of unease creasing her features. She did not yet understand, but instinct told her something was unraveling, something she could not control. The silence thickened. The truth hovered on the edge, waiting to tear through the room. And when it did, no mask would remain intact. The silence broke when Harlan's voice rang out firm and unshaken. "I am Harlan West, president of this company." Shock froze the room. Jonas's complexion drained his polished smile, collapsing into panic. Clara gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Silas stood motionless, his breath caught disbelief hollowing his eyes. Evelyn forced a brittle laugh, her lips stretching against fear. "Well, this is unexpected." But Harlan raised his hand, the folded scrap of paper gleaming between his fingers. His tone cut through her words. "No, there are no more buts. Not after this." The air shifted instantly. What had been a room of confusion became a stage for judgment. The lie of his disguise had ended, but the truth it uncovered was now unavoidable. For the listener, the twist landed like thunder, long foreshadowed, undeniable, and devastating. Harlan's gaze fixed on Evelyn, sharp as steel. His voice carried across the hall. The tips disappeared. "I saw you take them. And worse, you turned men like Silas into scapegoats for your theft." Evelyn's hands trembled, her mask of command splintering. She stammered words faltering under the weight of accusation. Jonas dropped his eyes to the floor, shame thick in his silence. Clara could no longer hold back. Tears streamed freely as she clutched her apron. Silas remained still, his eyes glistening, the vindication more heavy than triumphant. The power Evelyn wielded dissolved before everyone's eyes. Authority turned to exposure, discipline to disgrace. For the listener, the moment satisfied every wound inflicted earlier. Justice, long delayed, stood visible at last, and the hotel's silence broke under the weight of truth. Harlan turned to Silas, his voice steady grave. "You are the reason I still believe in honesty." Before the gathered staff, he declared a promotion, a stipend for his mother's care, and a path forward within the company. Applause swelled, filling the hall. Clara sobbed with relief. Jonas bowed his head in shame. Silas's tears fell freely as he whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." Harlan's closing words settled like a vow. Never judge a man by appearance. Kindness always finds its way into the light. If you've endured misunderstanding, yet kept your integrity, leave a heart. And to you listening until this very moment, thank you for choosing this story among countless others. We deeply value every thought you share. Support us with a like and subscribe so we can continue bringing you more stories worth your time.